You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 4th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, Vladimir Putin signs a decree to call up tens of thousands to join Russia's military. We'll ask how many will answer his call. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes. Alongside Hezbollah, Hamas and Iran, Yemen's Houthi rebels now launch missile attacks against Israel. We'll have the latest as the violence in the Middle East draws in more players. We'll also bring you Andrew Muller's assessment of what the last 7 days have taught us.
We learned from this week's debate between Senator Vance and his opposite number, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, that Vance does share with many members of the press a certain reflexive impatience with being pressed on the veracity of his yarns by pettifogging sub-editors.
Plus the papers, the latest economic and trade headlines, and we explore the power of protest architecture. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, though, a look at what else is happening in today's news. There have been large explosions overnight in the Lebanese capital Beirut as Israeli forces target Hezbollah. The British government has rejected claims that it's put the UK's security at risk by agreeing to give sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, and thousands of protesters have marched in Vienna to urge Austria's political parties not to go into government with a far-right Freedom Party. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories, but first, Russia's men are being called up again, with plans to draft up to 133,000 of them between now and January next year. President Vladimir Putin signed a decree earlier this week as part of the regular autumn conscription campaign. The bill also allows defendants to escape prosecution and scrap criminal proceedings against them if they enlist to go to war in Ukraine. Well, I'm joined now here in the studio by the Russia analyst Stephen Dalziel. A very good morning to you. Welcome back, Stephen.
Good morning, Emma.
Who do they want?
They want any young, fit men who, even if they have dodgy backgrounds, even if they've committed crimes, they need cannon fodder for the Russian army. So, as you said in your intro, the call-up happens at this time of the year anyway. But the big difference is this idea of people who are standing trial or are about to stand trial, instead of going ahead with the trial, can say, OK, I'll sign a contract with the Ministry of Defence and I'll go and serve in the army for a year. This
has happened before, hasn't it? I mean, not just during the 2022 onwards war, but didn't this happen in the Second World War as well?
Yes, because then, of course, also Russia desperately needed, or the Soviet Union desperately needed men. But it's become the norm in this war against Ukraine. Since September 2022, when the Wagner Group, remember them, they were signing up people from in prison, and some of the worst criminals, murderers, rapists, people serving long sentences, were told, well, come and serve for 6 months in the army in Ukraine, and you'll then go free. And we've already seen examples where that has caused problems because men who've survived and then gone back to their villages and have murdered and raped again. These are violent criminals. And this is one of the worrying things for Russian society, that you're releasing back into society, if they survive the war, if they're not just churned up in the as cannon fodder, which a lot of them are, but if they survive, they go back into an increasingly violent society. Now, one of the reasons they're doing it in this way, Putin just signing this decree to have 133,000 called up, making it look as if it's part of the normal call-up. But also in September 2022, he issued a mobilisation decree, so calling up more men than would otherwise have been the case.
And that led to a mass exodus, didn't it?
It led to a mass exodus, absolutely. We reckon probably about 1 million Russians left the country at that time because they didn't want to get called up. It's also led to a movement called The Way Home, Put Damoy, which they have a telegram presence. They've been described as a foreign agent, but they push on. This is women. These are women pushing for, in this case, mostly it's their husbands to be released, because those who were mobilised in 2022 are still there. They weren't called up just for a year or so. They've been called up. They've probably been given no leave. They're still fighting in Ukraine. Many of them obviously have been killed. So that's been a social movement, reflecting in some ways what happened during the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Then it was soldiers' mothers. Now it's soldiers' wives. On the whole, or brothers, their brothers and sisters, it's their sisters saying, I want my brother to come home. So that's an undercurrent. They've tried to stamp down on it, and this is what they don't seem to care nowadays. They seem to think that if we frighten people enough, that will shut them up, and we will push through what we want.
Is that the narrative that is now being pushed through? Because people will start to be missed when you have hundreds of thousands of young men leaving communities, some of them not coming back. That has a profound societal influence, doesn't it?
It does. It's exactly what happened during the war in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And I think that Putin has learned from that. And so, first of all, we must look back over the last 20 years and the propaganda that Putin has built up against Ukraine. This didn't start in 2022. It didn't even start in 2014 when they seized Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. It starts long before that. Ukraine is getting more and more heavily criticised and being told that they're Nazis and they're going to invade they're going to invade Russia and we must defend our borders and so on. So that's been building up. So you've got that background. Then you've got the mobilisation. Then you've got a certain amount of discontent in society. And the way they now deal with that, apart from keeping the propaganda going and pushing people by saying, look, this is what we've got to do this to defend Russia, then it's fear. That's ultimately what they're coming down to is, that if you criticise the war, if you even call it a war, then you can be sent to prison for a long time. And those are not the sort of people who are now being released. When they're saying, defendants, they're the sort of people who will go to prison. And those who are out-and-out criminals, rapists, murderers, thieves, and so on, are now being given the chance to say, actually, we'll stop your trial and you can go off to fight in the war, and if you come back, you're free. Yes,
I think the theory behind it is that they are repenting for their crimes through their military service.
Absolutely.
Although it does sort of, and Russia being historically extremely sort of well renowned for its sort of approach to crime and justice, it's an interesting approach. Let's move focus a little now to the Russian state budget, which has not really hit the headlines. And there's a reason for that, isn't there?
There is a reason, yes. And it's not hit the headlines in the Russian press either, because they really don't want people talking about it too much. Because the Duma has just passed the law. It's got to be signed into law by Putin. But the budget, the national budget for 2025 to 2027 allows for 41%, yes, you heard that right, 41% of the budget to be spent on defence and security, and therefore obviously a lot of it on the war. Just to put that in perspective, NATO countries, NATO is being, Russia is always saying that NATO is a big enemy. NATO countries, of NATO countries, Poland pays the largest percentage share of its budget on defence, 4.1%. Exactly 10 times less than Russia is
and the NATO target for GDP contribution is what, 2?
Is 2%, yes. The Americans pay 3.4% and Estonia pay 3.4%. So that's Poland, Estonia and the US pay the largest percentage-wise. But and that 2%, Britain says, we pay the 2%, but it's smoke and mirrors. They put in military pensions, they put in housing. This is not all going on weapons or even salaries for soldiers. So to say 41% of the budget is going to be spent on defence and security, it's a huge amount.
What will that do for Russia?
It'll ruin the economy. in the long run. What all this underlines, yet again, the fact, criminals going back into society, the economy being shot to bits because it's all for the war effort, it all points to the fact that this war really against Ukraine, it's all about Putin keeping power. So you spend as much, you don't care about the welfare of the population, you don't give them better homes or better infrastructure or provide gas to everyone's home. It's probably only less than 50% of Russians have gas piped to their home, even though it's the biggest gas producer in the country. So you don't care about that. You care about staying in power. And then the way you do it ultimately, going back to what I said earlier, is fear. You make them fear that if they do protest, then they'll be put into prison, which is a very nasty experience in Russia.
There are other parts of the budget. I think the utility tariffs are going up by 12%. So Russians daily will be pushed and will be squeezed by this, won't they?
They will. Yes. No. Utility prices going up as well. State pensions are pretty low. In fact, a few years ago they raised the state pension age. Most Russians, if they're pensioners and they don't have savings, they have to rely on their family. You can't live on a Russian state pension. I mean, it's peanuts. So it's when looked at from the outside, you take all these things into account and you say, well, why aren't Russians rising up? Well, there's a certain amount of the Russian stoicism. They've always said that Russians will just grin and bear it and get on with it. But it comes down, again, I'm sorry to repeat it once more, but it is fear. Putin has created such a climate of fear in the country that people think protesting won't do any good, it'll just get me locked up. And we just knuckle down and get on with it. And many, many Russians will be thinking, we hope for better times. But they're not going to go out onto the streets to protest because that's not what they tend to do.
Russia analyst Stephen Dalziel, thank you so much for joining me as ever in the studio right here on Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist. The time in Sana'a is 9:12am, 7:12am here in London, and you're back with The Globalist. Now, what do Yemen's Houthi rebels stand to gain from the intensifying violence in the Middle East? Since Israel stepped up its campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis have increased their operations against Israel. On Saturday, they fired a ballistic missile at Israel's main airport as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was coming back from New York. On Tuesday, there were more attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, and yesterday, Houthi militia claimed responsibility for a drone attack on Tel Aviv. Well, I'm joined now by Iona Craig, journalist who specialises in the Arabian Peninsula, a regular voice here. Very warm welcome to you. Good morning, Iona.
Good morning.
So why are the Houthis piling in now?
Well, I think the Houthis really want to assert themselves and their position in the axis of resistance. They want to be seen as an important part of that coalition. And actually, perhaps unlike Hezbollah, although it may be too late now, unlike Hezbollah, who would be resistant to further escalation, the Houthis are not afraid of that. And in fact, it's something they relish. We've spoken about this before, really, but the Houthis have thrived on conflict. And in fact, the war is necessary to them almost for their survival. They have been a fighting group since their almost creation and have spent the last 20 years at war on and off. And those off periods have been very brief. And the brief period they had of 2 years without really huge amounts of conflict between 2022 and sort of the end of last year was about 18 months, was when they started to have problems with governance. So yes, to have an external enemy, for them to be able to blame in many respects all the woes internally of what's happening economically and otherwise for Yemeni civilians in their territory, having a large external enemy is crucial to their survival. And they've got that sort of in spades now, not just in the terms of Israel, but also, of course, the US and the UK, who have also been carrying out airstrikes against them since January.
Tell us a little bit more about their dependence on Iran in all this. I mean, how independent or dependent are they here?
They've become increasingly dependent, certainly militarily, and in the terms of the ballistic missiles and drones that we've seen being used now regularly, that they've been firing towards Israel. A lot of those components have come from various parts of the world for those missiles and drones, including from China, and even evidence that some have come, maybe not intentionally, but from Germany as well. But yes, the Houthis at the beginning of all of this, way back in 2014, it's hard to imagine that it's been 10 years now since they've been controlling the capital in Yemen. But yes, they wouldn't have had those capabilities back in 2014. They'd taken over the Yemeni state stockpile of missiles, mostly of which were Russian, that the army had. But yes, that what has now become their sort of go-to has been these mid and long range or mid-range ballistic missiles and long-range capabilities of drones. And that has really been put in place by Iran, that has trained them to build those at home with components that are being sent in from outside. And, you've only got to see when these missiles are sort of displayed in military parades that they are pretty much replicas of what is seen in Iran. So, yes, the Houthis are reliant on Iran in that respect, but they are still, they are not a proxy. I think it's inaccurate to call them a proxy. They are independent minded and they are independent of what they do from Iran, but they are very much allies now in this war as is now sort of spiraling in the region and against Israel, and stand alongside Hezbollah and Iran. I mean, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, the leader of the Houthis, would very much have seen Nasrallah, who was killed 10 days ago now, or a week ago, I'm losing track, in Lebanon, would have been a mentor to him. And so, yes, there were strong ties between the Houthis and Hezbollah as well, where Houthi members have been sent to train in Lebanon over many years now. So, yeah, the ties are strong between all of these groups, and they're very much an alliance.
Well, you say, though, that the fact that they're an alliance, but they have independence to them. But the situation as it stands at the moment, we are seeing in the last week an escalation of violence between Iran sending missiles in the direction of Israel, and Israel promising and waiting to decide how it is going to retaliate here. Is there a chance here that Iran could begin to use, or could be using, the Houthis to as a sort of a proxy fighter against Israel? We have to be careful with the word proxy, as you say here. But given the situation, instead of a direct confrontation, the Houthis are a very useful way of targeting Israel, aren't they?
Absolutely, but I think using as well is can be a bit misleading. The Houthis would do this happily off their own bat. They don't need any encouragement from Iran. If anything, in the past, they've even turned down restraint from Iran when Iran has tried to restrain them. So, yeah, the Houthis are more than willing and happy to go along with this, and in fact would very much like to lead it in many respects. And of course, they've already effectively got control over the Red Sea. That would be a real point for Iran if this does escalate further and Iran wants to take action in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Then, of course, between the Houthis and Iran, they would have control of those two vital waterways together, either side of the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, around 30% of global oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz. Also, 20%, around 20% of global LNG, mainly coming from Qatar. And then, of course, the Houthis are able to have a strong influence on the safety of shipping now going through the Red Sea and up to the Suez Canal. So that could have a real effect if Iran did go down that route on oil and LNG coming through from that side of the Arabian Peninsula to Europe. And that's where it could be felt in Europe quite heavily. And of course, there's more LNG now coming from Qatar than before, because of the reduction in gas coming from Russia because of the war in Ukraine. And so Europe is increasingly reliant on that supply of LNG for keeping themselves warm during the winter. So yes, together they could really have a serious stronghold over the supplies of oil and gas coming out of the Middle East if they chose to do so. And I could see them working in collaboration definitely on that.
Iona Craig, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
I'm stocking up on just everything that I possibly can because I think the grocery stores are going to be empty.
We'll be reviewing the impact of the US port strikes and other economic news. Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. In the studio is Vincent McAvenny, political journalist and Monocle Radio regular. Good morning, Vinny.
Good morning.
How's life in the McAvenny world?
Well, I got back from California earlier this week, so it's adjusting to the much chillier temperatures and greyer skies of London currently.
Sorry about that. It's awful. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're interested or not, it's awful. What's in the papers? Awful or not so bad today?
It's a pretty busy day in the papers today, lots to choose from. Top is some offhand remarks from Joe Biden. And really, US presidents and speaking to cameras as they go to the helicopter drives us in news crazy because it's always a really hard sort of soundbite to cut with the whirring of Marine One behind. But Joe Biden is making a habit of sort of saying things increasingly as he goes to the helicopter and sort of tapering off in that way that he slightly does now, but moving markets with some offhand comments, discussing what Israel's retaliation could be on Iran after that attack earlier this week. He sort of made the off-the-cuff remark that when someone said, are they considering hitting Iran's oil infrastructure, he said, we're discussing that. I think that would be a little anyway... and then sort of finished the sentence, which sent crude spiking 5% immediately and has now increased some 10% since that large-scale missile attack. So a slightly offhand remark from a president who should know more, sending oil prices upwards, just as every government around the world is fighting inflation still. And we're still waiting to hear. We know that Washington has sort of publicly warned Israel not to go after Iran's nuclear facilities, but we are still in this limbo of seeing how and when they will react.
On a wider point, this does raise just how important or relevant the United States is in all of this, given the fact that for the last 2 or 3 weeks we have been looking at a world, or two or 3 years, arguably longer, an increasingly sort of polarised world where secondary powers have managed to exert their influence and the ability, recently at least, for the United States to try and rein in other countries or direct the events of other countries, just thinking about what's happening in the Middle East now, has diminished. And people have said the United States no longer has the influence either in front of or behind doors to get things done. However, 3-4 words from Joe Biden under a noisy helicopter is enough to actually make us all jump. So there's a really difficult moment now for the United States, isn't there, because of the private influence that it has, or diminishing amount, but nonetheless its public ability to really send things in new directions.
Essentially because everyone knows that they are the only nation, even though you've got other countries working in close cooperation with Israel for its defence, like France, like the UK, we saw that again earlier this week. The only one that holds any real clout is the United States because of the amount of aid it gives Israel, because of the amount of weapons it provides. So this is the only nation really that is able to exert any control. Now, there are arguments that Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has long ago decided that he wants Trump back in office, that he's going to try and weaken Joe Biden somewhat, perhaps in the run-up to that election. There is, of course, now Kamala Harris coming in, but it seems that Netanyahu is still calculating that perhaps he'll end up with President Trump, who will let him get away with a lot more.
Let's move on to this story about the fact that yesterday the United Kingdom surrendered, as being described by some of the angrier papers, the Chagos Islands to Mauritius.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So the Chagos Islands are a band of islands in the Indian Ocean. They've been under dispute for decades because the Chagosians themselves that lived there were relocated to the United Kingdom, and the UK and US have operated this very secret base, this huge base called Diego Garcia, where their long-range bombers are. It's a major strategic point for Asian defence, Southeast Asian defence, and global projection for the two countries. Naval ships dock there. But there has been this ongoing dispute, as I say. But the UK government has now signed a deal with Mauritius to hand over sovereignty to the Chagosian Islands, but to maintain that military base for at least the next 99 years. But apparently there's disquiet about this in the United States. But a blame game has erupted. And guess who seems to be at the centre of all of this? Liz Truss.
Really? I thought it was James Cleverly.
49-day Prime Minister is being blamed for this, another part of her legacy perhaps, because what seems to have happened is that under her time as Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister, negotiations were opened up with Mauritius to hand back the islands. James Cleverly was then Foreign Secretary. He then continued this, but David Cameron shut it all down, perhaps wisely thinking this isn't the right thing to do. Labour, though, have now come in and within 3 months agreed to this, but a blame game. The Tories were very quick yesterday to say that Labour was being weak in handing over this, but now there's a blame game in amongst the Tories because it seems as though it was all started off by them and Labour were just having to complete the process that they had begun.
Right, there we go. Let's have a look at the next story that's popped up on our list to deal with. This is a headline that broke last night, which is the members of Parliament here in the United Kingdom are going to be allowed to vote on the practice and the concept of assisted dying here in the United Kingdom for the first time, and it's nigh on a
9
decade.
years. Yeah, that's right. And obviously completely different makeup of MPs. It was rejected last time. But this is something where, when you look at the polling on this issue, there has been a huge shift in polling in the past decade, perhaps because more and more people have seen older relatives. The sort of, that big post-war generation is starting to, some of them come to the end of their lives, and they've seen problems that they've had, particularly with rising levels of dementia and other ailments. And so assisted dying is on the agenda now for MPs.
It's also changed globally, hasn't it? That with the likes of Canada.
Yeah, there has been more of a change internationally as well. And what the UK is finding is that there's parts of the UK moving out of step. So you've got the Crown Dependencies, Jersey, where I'm from, Isle of Man, and they have voted for this with strict controls. And it's starting to be implemented. Scotland potentially as well, breaking ahead and doing this. And so now they're looking at a UK-wide approach so that one nation doesn't perhaps become a hotspot, so that people don't have to travel as they have been doing to Dignitas in Switzerland, and the legal issues that creates for anyone that assists them when they come back. So this will be a free vote. It's going to be controversial. Obviously, religious groups are opposed, and also you've got disability campaigners who think it will put unnecessary pressure, and if it's not calculated right, cause real problems for disabled people. But it will definitely be an interesting moment, because there was indications before the last general election that there was support, a majority in Parliament. It will be a free vote to pass this through, but it's just having the conversation. It seems, whereas a decade ago it was possibly still quite unthinkable, it seems that the public, there is an appetite for a proper conversation on this now.
Finally, let's look at a story in the Times about how the moon grew colder during the pandemic.
Yeah, this is a really interesting story, and obviously you remember the pandemic, the sort of first lockdown in particular, where of course there was, schools were shut, offices were shut, borders closed, there was fewer flights going, so there was less pollution in the air, and a study is arguing that also affected the moon, that it caught a chill, and that readings taken on the surface of the moon during its nighttime show it was markedly cooler during the first global lockdown, with temperatures at some sites down several degrees before rising again as the world reopened a few months later. And scientists think this is perhaps because of the way that the pollution in our atmosphere was reflecting sunlight back up at the moon and raising the temperature there. So our global warming here also having an impact, it seems, on the moon.
Vincent McAviney, thank you so much for joining us here in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. The time is just nudging 7:30 a.m. here in London. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Iran has said any nation providing assistance to Israel will become a legitimate target. The Iranian mission to the UN said in a statement that it advised countries to refrain from entangling themselves in the conflict with Israel. Earlier, the US President Joe Biden said they were discussing possible strikes on Iranian oil facilities. The British government's rejected claims that it's put the UK's security at risk by agreeing to give sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. A Foreign Office minister said the UK had been given a very clear guarantee to ensure national security interests were protected. And thousands of protesters have marched in Vienna to urge Austria's political parties not to go into government with the far-right Freedom Party. The FPÖ came first with 29% of the vote in an historic win this weekend. The party was founded in the 1950s under a leader who had been an SS officer and Nazi lawmaker. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. The time is just nudging 9:31 in Kyiv, 8:31 in Zurich. Now, while so much of the narrative surrounding conflict highlights the military and political side of it, there is still plenty more to focus on, especially when it comes to the effect on communities. Well, my next guest knows both sides. As a broadcast journalist and Oscar-nominated filmmaker, Azad Safarov works with Sky News journalists in Ukraine as a producer. But also as the founder of the Voices of Children Charitable Foundation, Azad campaigns to help to meet the long-term psychological needs of children affected by war. I'm delighted to say he joins me now. A very good morning to you, Azad.
Good morning, Emma.
Thank you so much for coming into the studio. Just tell us, what is, if you can indeed define it, the effect of conflict on a child growing up? And what do you see happening to someone?
It's awful. Just imagine yourself that you're waking up in the morning and you need to go to school, but you're thinking about like what happened last night, because every night there is now shelling from Russia with drones, with missiles, especially in such cities like Kharkiv, like Dnipro, where we have our spaces for the kids where they can come and work with psychologists. So imagine that this spaces is open for kids, but they sometimes afraid even leaving their houses because to get these spaces, it's still like you're risking your life. And staying at home also you're risking your life. You don't know where the missile will get you. So it is living all the time like in panic, in stress, and kids mostly worried not about themselves, they worried about their parents. Sometimes they feel helpless and they harms themselves. They hurt themselves because they think that they can't protect their parents, especially if they were taken away from their fathers, who is now on the front line. So imagine the situation with the kids who left Ukraine, for example, or who left east part of Ukraine, moved to west part of Ukraine. This kid still thinks about his parents who left behind. And we got a lot of calls also like from abroad, from the kids, from the teenagers themselves with the suicide thoughts sometimes because they feel alone, they feel far from their friends, far from their roots, far from their parents, and they feel helpless. And this is how we're trying to stabilize them. We're trying to support them, to calm them down, and to make a first psychological assistance.
And this is where Voices of Children comes in. But you're not a product of the Russian invasion of February 2022, are you? You go way back. You're a decade old.
We go way back. We started from 2015. And back that time, it was so difficult to explain people that the mental health is so important. Because, in post-Soviet countries, when you come to someone and say, you need psychological, let's provide your kids psychological help, the parents say, what? My kid is not psycho. What do you mean? And I myself from Azerbaijan, for example, was born there. Even now, it's so difficult to talk about psychological help in Azerbaijan. But thanks God, now, after full invasion in Ukraine, parents already starting to call us. And teenagers, you will be surprised. Mostly it is teenagers who call us themselves asking for the help. And this is huge change. In 2015, in 2016, when we arrived to the schools in the east part of Ukraine where the war broke, and they were complaining us about the situation with the kids. And we said, okay, our psychological will come and help you. No. We are a normal school. We have normal kids. We don't need your help.
It's an interesting tale, isn't it? Because to see someone like you who, didn't your mother say become a journalist because it's the most peaceful profession in Ukraine?
Yes. Yes.
I wonder if she's changed her mind at any point. The interesting thing with what you do is you've turned this into a documentary as well. And your documentary House Made of Splinters, which nominated for an Oscar, wasn't it? Which must have been incredible. Yes. The opening scene tells an awful lot about just how complicated the situation is, because it grows up you're in a sort of a communal house for children who cannot be with their parents for whatever reason. And you think that they work as an institution, but actually there's a waking up process at the beginning, and the children are woken up really differently depending on who they are by the staff. And you very much, at that point, you suddenly realise that you're not dealing with a group of children, you're dealing with individual people. And you know that each person has to be treated differently in order to maintain an element of strength for the future.
Absolutely right. By the way, this documentary was made by a director similar and Quillman, and we were making it together. But this scene, like even walking in orphanage, you can see how different the kids and how personal approach you need to make to them. But Russians mostly abducted the kids from orphanage, mostly because they know that it's vulnerable kids. They don't have a parents. And in our orphanage, unfortunately, a lot of kids, they are social orphans. So they do have a parents, but their parents lost their parental rights because of alcohol or drug abuse. But it's also the afterwards of the war, because in east part of Ukraine, it was because of the war, the economical situation get worse, and a lot of parents, they just gave up of looking some job or looking for some possibilities for their kids. So they just started to drink. And this makes everything worse with the kids. And when Russia's trying to abduct our kids from the orphanage, from the shelters, they do know that they can change and brainwash our kids. So when we took kids back, we put a lot of our resources to bring them mentally back to their reality. As
a journalist, you will know full well the way that a running order and a priority changes. And we have seen a huge focus on Ukraine in 2022, 2023, and then we now have the world's focus turning to the Middle East and other conflicts as well. How do you make sure that what you do stays in the public eye?
We do our best. For example, being here for interview, but also we are making advocacy tours around the world. Also, we made a book where we collected 100 quotes of the kids from Ukraine. For us, it's also important to bring attention of the world to the kids' problem in Ukraine through the different ways.
And is there enough protection and, are there enough structures internationally that can ensure that this can happen? I mean, can the UN step in, or what is there to help you?
In Ukraine, we have some skeptical thoughts about international organizations, some of international, especially UN, We're waiting when they will stop, just speaking, but just bring and do something. So we still need a lot of help from international organizations. We still need a lot of support for bringing, first of all, kids back from Russia to Ukraine, and also financing rehabilitation of those kids who are living in Ukraine. Because this trauma, if you not help them now, in 10, 15 years, it will be much, much worse for the country and for the kids.
Azad Savara, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're with Monocle Radio. It's time now for Andrew Muller to round up everything we know now that we didn't know at the start of the week. Here's what we learned.
We learned this week that our search for an opening fanfare was once again going to be made that much easier by yet another artist wishing out loud that Donald Trump would desist from playing their songs at his rallies, at which he says words to delirious yokels. In this instance, Venerable Boogie Dispenser's Little Feet. Who, it seems, though they may be keen, as the song declaims, to let it roll, are less willing to let it slide. Is that anything? Tough crowd.
Just got an old wristwatch on my own.
We continued to learn, however, that of all the words which may be accurately applied to Donald Trump once prefixed with un, hinged, glued, moored, balanced, and so forth, daunted was not among them. For we learned that despite a long succession of Trump-branded products which have turned out to be scams, duds and/or failures, one thinks of Trump University, Trump Steaks, Trump Magazine, Trump Vodka, Trump Sneakers, Trump Coins, Eric, he now proposed to bring to market Trump Watches.
The Trump Victory Tourbillon. This isn't just any watch, it's one of the best watches made. It's a tourbillon watch with almost 200 grams of gold and more than 100 real diamonds. That's a lot of diamonds. I love gold. I love diamonds. We all do.
We learned when we looked into the purchase of one such, the Office Secret Santa being really only a few weeks off, that the asking price is, and you may want to repair to the fainting couch for this, 1 actual 100 actual 1,000 actual US actual dollars. Still, we for one whimsical news monologue are absolutely certain that said timepieces represent outstanding and lasting value and are absolutely not dubious knockoffs hastily plastered with Trump branding in some grim Guangzhou sweatshop with a view to parting fools from the contents of their wallets. Honestly, does that sound like the sort of scheme that Donald Trump would ever lend his name to, does it? And no, we will not at this time be rising above a joke about Trump watches having unusually small hands. Anyway, we learned of Trump's vice presidential running mate, as of this recording, Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio, that should American voters about a month from now decide that they are not, upon sober reflection, willing to risk making him deputy Earth's most powerful individual to a morbidly obese 78-year-old who has never eaten a vegetable, he may have a future in journalism.
Ooh, I can't wait to see where this goes.
Tell me more.
Let's see where this goes.
We learned from this week's debate between Senator Vance and his opposite number, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, that Vance does share with many members of the press a certain reflexive impatience with being pressed on the veracity of his yarns by pettifogging sub-editors.
Thank you, Governor. And just to clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status, temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn now to the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
the rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check.
We have, of course, learned from Vance's dreadful book, Hillbilly Elegy, maybe it improves dramatically after about the first 30 pages, we'll never know, that he cannot write a lick, though this is not necessarily an impediment to a career in the print media, as is evinced by the bewilderingly successful careers of and especially that ridiculous hack. Not, you understand, that we're bitter. We learned, however, or rather were reminded, that Vance is not the world's only holder of high office with literary aspirations. Maestro, the national anthem of Turkmenistan. We learned that former President Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov thereof, whose ventures into hip-hop may be recalled by listeners who, whether professionally obliged or merely interested, monitor the cultural effusions of Central Asian despots, appears to be finding the days difficult to fill since being shunted out of the chain of command and endowed with an ego-stroking vanity title to shut him up. And speaking as a contributing editor, we feel that angst. The chairman of the People's Council, as his business card now introduces him, has turned his hand to poetry.
Oh no.
Which has been dutifully published by Turkmen state media, and we learned that it goes, in part, like this.
Its pillars are of love, an unbroken building. The laughter of children is the most beautiful day. It's a world we have to live in. In general, Turkmenistan is the country of peace and trust, which has a high goal for the world.
It may have lost something in translation. We can only hope so. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mullett.
Thank you, Andrew. And a brand new instalment of What We Learned will air this time next week, right here on The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's talk business now with Vicky Price, economist, former joint head of the UK government's economic service and a regular voice here on The Globalist. Welcome back, Vicky. Good morning.
Good morning.
Let's talk about the impact of the strikes at US ports. I mean, there is a genuine fear, is there now, of the amount of effect that this could have on people's ability to buy and sell.
Absolutely. And we had already seen, in fact, sort of container costs going up very significantly recently. Well, up and down, a little bit volatile, but overall going up again, which had been a real worry, which of course affects prices at the end of the day. But the good news is that this strike has been suspended. It was just announced late yesterday. The dock workers at the US and Eastern Gulf Coast ports seem to have agreed to still negotiate because the employers have come with a slightly bigger offer. So they started working, moving cargo again. That's what the reports are suggesting. But they are still negotiating. So for the moment, it seems like there is some light at the end of the tunnel because, of course, it would have affected a very large percentage of trade that takes place across the world. And if you add to that all the worries about what's been going on in the Red Sea, that is really a relief, given that everything else in terms of conflicts and so on is going the wrong way. At least that's good news.
I mean, it's quite a big hike, put it that way. I think it's a pay increase of 62%.
Well, absolutely. They may have a legitimate reason for asking that increase. I think they had been offered, considerably less before. I think it was something like 50%, but they wanted more. So we'll see. But I think what has been recognized is the importance of ensuring that at least the rest of the world, except where there are these real issues in terms of terrorism, is still functioning, because I think that affects hugely both what may be happening in the US, but also, of course, Europe and the prices, as I said earlier, that we pay. But it's been suspended for the moment, but we have until January the 15th to see whether there's some new agreement that could perhaps be reached.
Joe Biden has stepped in on this story and has said that the tentative agreement is a good example for collective bargaining, critical progress towards a strong contract. This has been backed up and echoed by the Vice President and Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris. How much is the United States now becoming or taking unionization more seriously? Because this is something that this out of all strikes that we've seen in the United States in the last couple of years could have absolutely stymied the country's economy.
You're absolutely right. And it's interesting because across the world, what we have seen is that unionization has fallen and the power of the unions has declined. And we have seen that also in what workers have been able to extract out of the economy over the last 50 years or so, which really has not increased as a percentage. And certainly it has not done so in the US. And the fact that there are some pockets where unionization is actually quite important, and this bargaining sort of strength seems to be played out in the favour of workers, is in many ways something that we had forgotten. And I think with the US now, under President Biden receiving quite a lot of stimulus in terms of ensuring that, a lot of stuff is produced in the US rather than anywhere else with the Inflation Reduction Act, I think there is absolutely no interest by the administration or anyone else perhaps who comes in after to stymie that type of growth that they seem to think that the US should be getting in order to rival China. So I think it would have been bad news if it carried on, not just, as I said, for the US, but also for everyone else. But you can see that there are pockets where unionization or unions are really very strong.
Let's move on to another story. We touched on it in the paper review about half an hour ago, and the ability for Joe Biden's passing remarks as he walks under the blades of a very noisy helicopter can cause absolute consternation. The fact that the United States and Israel are mulling over what their reaction can be to Iran sending missiles in Israel's direction earlier this week, and the question being raised about targeting nuclear plants as well. This has had a huge effect on the price of oil.
Yes, I mean, we've seen a 10% rise since the beginning of this week, which is quite substantial. So we're talking about oil prices hovering at around sort of $77 a barrel right now, from around sort of 70. There had been discussions before, at least analysts were suggesting that the price of oil would fall below 70. And there have been times when that has been the case recently, because, of course, oil demand was quite weak. China was not doing particularly well. And also we were beginning to see signs from OPEC and some of the oil producing countries themselves individually, talking about perhaps starting to expand production rather than keeping too tight sort of production cuts, which of course had been the habit for quite some time now to keep prices up. So there was going to be more plentiful supply. And demand was not doing particularly well. And now all that has been reversed. Now the question is how high oil prices might go, and whether, given that there is still quite a lot of supply around and stocks and so on, whether this is just temporary, it's a reaction. But the longer the current incursion into Lebanon, anything else that may happen with Iran continues, then that's going to certainly keep oil prices high.
Indeed, because Iran's ability to control not just the flow but also the transportation of oil globally is significant, isn't it?
Yes, and that is one of the issues that people are raising now. So when you talk to any of the sort of market analysts who do nothing but look at that, that's really where the worry is. If indeed we move in that direction, then oil prices could rise significantly too. But of course, we've seen before that there are spikes, and then oil prices start, come down as soon as whatever tension there might have been is, comes to an end. So you don't know how long this will last, but I'm suspecting that in the short to medium term, we're going to have prices considerably higher than we thought, and people will feel it when they start going to the petrol stations as well, because what tends to happen is the moment oil prices go up, they get reflected very, very quickly in prices at the pump. When they come down, not so fast.
Indeed. Would there be other countries that could step in to increase their production?
Yes. I mean, we had already seen from Saudi, of course, that there had been intentions of doing more. The UAE has been doing a little bit more. So, yes, I think there could be some countervailing increases in supply. But as you said, it's really, if it's an issue also of transporting oil, then that's going to be have more of an impact, I think, on prices than just the actual production of it itself. Given that, in fact, for the moment there was an oversupply. Let's
have a look at Britain now, and there are plans to change fiscal rules and to borrow. Just explain what the government is outlining.
Well, the government is talking about investing in two particular sites in the country to encourage an increase and take-up of carbon capture and storage, something which is already beginning to happen, but in a small scale across the world. But it's vital in terms of, if it works, capturing CO2 from the atmosphere or in the production process, and then hiding it for a long period of time. It has been quite an expensive thing to do in the past, but the interesting thing, nevertheless, is that there's been big debate about whether the government is going to be moving us into a period of austerity immediately, and all sorts of increases in taxes in various areas and taking away some privileges elsewhere in order to plug this gap. Well, there is also discussion of looking at easing that whole situation by looking at the fiscal rules, which say that you have to start reducing your debt to GDP ratio within 5 years. It's a rolling average. It's not really such a dramatic, tight rule for the government. But a lot of what is being said now is that, yes, OK, you could still have the rule, but you should exclude investment. So if you can borrow to invest, and this is one example of perhaps, borrowing to invest. We're talking about £21 billion, which might be invested in this over 25 years. It's not huge, but it does suggest that perhaps there is indeed some change in the attitude, and we'll hear a lot more of what can be done to play around with the figures, if you like, on October the 30th when the budget is.
Vicky Price, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London, 7:54, and from beacons to barricades, architecture has always had a connection to activism, and as a result, architecture has also become the focal point for some striking imagery which evokes a political cause. Now, a new book called Protest Architecture, Structures of Civil Resistance has been published by the Royal Institute of British Architects, the RIBA, and it explores this meeting point between architecture and activism. Its author is Nick Newman, architect and founder of design practice Studio Bark, and he spoke to Monocle's Maylee Evans to talk about what protest architecture is.
Protest architecture can mean a few things, but in the context of the book, it's a retelling of the history of protest through the eyes of an architect. You're looking at how buildings and protest are related all throughout history. I think when a lot of people think about protest, the thing they're thinking least about is structure. But then when you look at an example like the barricade, the kind of French Revolution, that's probably quite an obvious image that sticks in people's heads. A barricade is a way of pulling down buildings, overturning cars, buses, whatever it happens to be, to block roads. So that's a very kind of simple idea of how you can use a structure of some form. Whether you can call that architecture is more of a debate, but it is nonetheless a use of structure. On the other end, you might have something which has been designed specifically for protest, so a type of tower or a kind of a roadblock that has been meticulously designed in order to specifically fulfill a function. And protest architecture covers everything between those two things.
Police arrested 280 climate change protesters that brought central London to a standstill yesterday. 2 further weeks of demonstrations are planned as Extinction Rebellion activists demand governments take urgent action on climate change.
So maybe let's focus on some of those more designed elements. So when we're creating structures specifically for protest, what are designers or architects, what do they need these structures to do? What are we trying to facilitate here?
Protest architecture can be used in, I suppose, more of a kind of occupation situation. The design brief or the goal is to occupy a space for as long as possible and to keep people there. Or it could be used as a kind of a visual symbol, for example, overlaying an existing building, creating a structure to create dialogue or some kind of satire. The one that a lot of people would think about when they see these structures is the ones that are intended to keep people there on a site. Typically, you would be trying to keep a protester up at height, and this is in countries where there is some form of health and safety legislation or human rights, where a police officer or other state official couldn't simply just pull someone down at height or push a tower over. They need to go about things in a kind of a calm and peaceful and safe manner, just as the protester might not open up with sort of violence or anything either. It's a kind of agreement between the protester and the police officer that everyone's going to act peacefully, and then it just becomes like a puzzle, if you like, for how to take the structure down.
So you've got specialist practitioners and architects getting involved. When you're thinking about designing these structures, are you going for high spec or specialised materials, or are we looking at more off-the-shelf components that are readily available?
It's important as a designer to think about everything in a design. You need to think about the actual kind of physical properties of the material as well as the aesthetics. Some might think that in a protest how something looks isn't important, but actually I found that's not quite true. Going back to the idea of the barricade, typically that would be made of things that you just found on the street, and you can see it fulfills a function, if you like, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's kind of visually appealing. If you create something which is intentionally designed, it can be a thing of wonder. One of the kind of common materials is like bamboo, because it's sustainable, it's fast growing, it's also very lightweight, very strong, so you can have these kind of wonder materials, if you like, that perform a load of positive things all at once. Let's say you were building a structure out of steel and concrete. People might look at that and go, hey, aren't you supposed to be protesters for the environment or whatever cause? So I think it's important that your messaging fits with your aesthetic.
And that was Nick Newman talking there to Maylee Evans. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to producers Anita Riotta, Tom Webb and Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Sana Jumani. Our studio manager was Lily Austin. For now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening and have a great weekend.